Well, and that is the interesting thing about Sodom and Gomorrah is that everybody always equates it to just hedonistic debauchery, these illicit, often sexual activities, but there are other people who kind of tie it back to the antediluvian world, that like maybe there was something more esoteric going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now whether it was just an offshoot of the same kind of idolatry.
Well, let me give you a few details on that then, if you don't
Yeah,
mind,
please.
because
I would love to. Yeah.
Again, that's why the details in the Bible are so important. And Sodom and Gomorrah is talked throughout the Bible, so it's an important event. And then Jesus mentioned it, which means you really need to pay attention to it. So and sodomy comes from the word Sodom. So we know that type of sexual behavior was probably ongoing, but the polytheists look at Sodom and Gomorrah as cities of light, cities of knowledge, cities that just a few chapters before, the city on the hill, the shining city on the hill is the allegory. And Camelot and all of the 1,000 points of light allegories that the globalists like to use, that people need to be aware of, so that you understand. 4 times, 2 with the Son, 2 with the Father. So one at the funeral, George Jr. used 1,000 points of light. So when we look at Sodom and Gomorrah, a few chapters earlier, it's led by 5 kings. And these kings are in the War of Giants. And these kings are Canaanite kings, but they're led by post-diluvian giants, which I don't talk a whole bit about in the first book because I didn't want to get people too confused. But these aren't Nephilim, these are Rephaim. These are the post-diluvian giants. For the sequel.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have a great chapter. I do War of Giants, but I do it in a whole expanded way in the new book. So the War of Giants, you've got 4 kings coming from Mesopotamia who are all giants. One is even lion-like, like the lion men of Moab, as another kind of Nephilim or Rephaim.
Like a chimera? Or
no, an offspring of fallen angels to create another kind of Nephilim. Again, I'll put that in the second book. So you've got different kinds of Nephilim other than the serpentine ones that I talk about in the first
I got
book.
You. Yes.
Right. So they're going to fight all of these other giant nations. They're going to fight the Rephaim in Syria. They're going to fight the Horim. They're going to fight the Amalekim. These aren't Amalekites. These are Amalekim because it happens before the Amalekites are born in Genesis 36 through a Horim female, Rephaim. There's several tribes of Rephaim, and Timnah is a Horim princess, son of Seir, which goes back to the Hebrew word satir, which is a satyr, which is a goat god.
Interesting.
But he's a Rephaim, and Eliphaz, who is the son of Esau. Again, I'll get into that aspect into this first book that for people to read. But you have other kings, whether or not it is the Zu in Ham, you've got all of these nations that are being attacked by these Mesopotamians, and the kings that are ruling over the 5-city pentapolis of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain are Rephaim kings, even though they are ruling over Canaanites, and Canaanite, what I would call hybrids. And so you've got Rephaim around with Sodom and Gomorrah. So if you go to Genesis 10, because I might have lost some people here, and you get the table of nations in Genesis 10, it also will come up in First Chronicles, but you have Canaan, who is a Hamite, who produces Heth and the Hittites, and Sidon for the Sidonites. And then you get this whole list of families, no patriarchs. They're the patriarchless families of Canaan. And so if you are a Rephaim, you are not a patriarch in the table of nations. So a classic example would be Arba, who's the father of Anak. He's not in the table of nations. Rapha is thought to be the patriarch for the Rephaim after the flood. And you have these names that sort of come out of nowhere. These are hybrid nations. So when in Numbers 13:33, when they're talking about before the embellished report that has Nephilim in there, or the giants, it's used twice in 1333. It talks about the Anakim are giants, and giants goes back to Nephilim, except that Deuteronomy 2 says the Anakim are Rephaim. Giants goes back to Rapha and Rephaim. And they're embellishing it because in that report so that Israelites won't go in because they don't want to fight these monsters. But in the actual details of the report that Caleb and Joshua are all reporting on, you have not only people that are taller than Israel that live in the mighty walls, but you have the Anakim kings, Sheshai, Talmai, and Ahiman. And then in Deuteronomy 1, Moses is talking about this before they start out to take the conquest of the land 40 years later, and he's recapping the accurate details of that, where you have people that are taller. Those are a hybrid people that are throughout, and they're created through intermarrying with the daughters of Canaan, Sidon, and Heth. And that's why the patriarchs aren't listed. And then Canaan, Heth, and Sidon will also have their descendants intermarry with Rephaim as well, but you have them as the patriarchs because they were the first generation.
Do you think... go ahead. I'm sorry.
And I went on a rabbit trail there, but getting back to what we were talking about. So when you have the event of Sodom and Gomorrah and the two angels who are depicted as human beings, and they eat and drink and they have a physical form.
Yeah.
So angels can take physical forms, and we can talk about that in detail if you want. But for now, and it's a great discussion. They are recognized as being angels, even though they look like men. And beforehand, they weren't recognized as angels until they identified themselves. And so they want to have sex with these angels. Well, angels can take a form any way they want in the physical world. They can take a male form or a human form. So it's not clear in that the book of Peter and the book of Jude is referenced here, is talking about, are they actually wanting to have homosexual sex with them? Or do they want to reproduce again with fallen angels that they know that they can take another form?
That's what I was going to ask.
Provide daughters for them to produce more Rephaim after the flood.
Right. So they can rebuild their Nephilim army off of them. Yeah.
That always made sense to me.
Well, and that's the thing that no one ever talks about this stuff, Gary, ever. Like in the Protestant Christian church.
You won't hear it in the pulpit.
No, exactly. You won't hear it in the pulpit. When I started, I wrote a 7-novel series called Heavenly Realms about the wars between the angels. It was largely just fictionalized, kind of medieval warfare, kind of whatever. But a lot of it was helped along by Clarence Larkin's The Spirit World, which was a book written, you're probably familiar with it, written in 1920, given to me by my father. And that's where I first read about the Nephilim. And I brought it up. I went to a private Christian school. No one in the Christian school had any idea what I was talking about. Everybody shot me down. You know, I got the righteous sons of Seth line every single time. So, you know, so many people, it's so strange how, and we have very smart people in our family who take the same approach of, like, when you try to approach people with this stuff, most of the time, you know, they'll believe in God, they'll believe in Jesus, the Godhood, the Trinity, they'll believe in Satan, they'll believe in angels, the resurrection. They'll believe in demons, miracles,
donkey
and angels
donkeys.
And demons are not the same thing, you know. They're fallen and faithful, but like when you get to this, when you start getting into like giants, and one of the great things about what Gary Wayne does with the Genesis 6 conspiracy is, if you haven't noticed yet, his exhaustive research really ties together things that seem fanciful and are he removes stumbling blocks, I think, from a lot of Christians' lives, because no one, and I think there's a good reason why no one talks about this kind of stuff with the Nephilim and the giants and the antediluvian age and how they have continued on with Sodom and Gomorrah and these other places. I mean, this stuff is relevant, and I think it's every bit as legitimate. And it's just so funny how people will accept something like angels, but when it comes to human angel hybrid kingdoms and bloodlines and how they control people, that almost becomes too comic booky for them. You know, it becomes too Lord of the Rings. The irony being that after reading about the Fairy Kingdom chapters,
the Ring Lords,
I start to think that like Lord of the Rings must have been an analog for between the elves and the orcs, and you know there seems to be anyway.
It's an antediluvian story before the flood, and at the end of the trilogy, you have all of these different kinds of beings that are represented and allegorical of the beings as they're understood in the occult world. They leave on a boat on the water because now it's the time of man. Right?
Yeah.
So now it's the age of man. That's the flood representation.
Oh, it is.
Very
I
interesting.
never thought about that.
I never connected that.
Man, that's killer.
That's awesome.